Hi, everyone. We're about to get started here. So we have the task and challenge of closing out what's been an amazing day of talks with a lot of amazing panelists. I just want to give my thanks to all the panelists that have spoken with us today, to the Virgil Abloh Foundation, to Design Miami, um, and to Theaster Gates for creating such a lovely space for both this day of talks and the rest of the talks throughout the fair. So this final conversation, I think, is fitting in that we're kind of encompassing a lot of what was discussed earlier today. So we're talking about material culture and cultural memory. And I'm joined by three amazing panelists. Professor Salamishah Tillet, winner of the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, and the Henry Rutgers Professor of Africana Studies and Creative Writing at Rutgers University. American artist, an artist that makes thought experiments that mine the history of technology, race, and knowledge production. And Chloe Sultan, director of clocks and architecture, care of Virgil Abloh. So to begin the conversation, I wanted to start with this first image. So in thinking about material culture, thinking about cultural memory, I think the word black is a kind of implied parenthetical in both of those, and we were talking about Virgil Abloh, um, not exclusively, but an important part of his work is in conversation with this kind of black material culture and black cultural memory. And thinking about that, I thought about the image of the plastic on the couch, which is a kind of an image that I think is relevant for a lot of kind of diasporic peoples. A lot of it's a kind of idiomatic image almost in a way that I think represents so much of what the conversation about cultural memory can be about. So you have this plastic that's covering a surface. There's this sort of transparency. There's also a question of preservation and maintenance over a long period of time. And I've kind of juxtaposed that with an image of one of Virgil's track and field shoes, which is kind of playing with this idea of the layers of transparency, an overshoe that's kind of a transparent layer. And so I kind of wanted to start with this, with the question about just, sorry, I'm gonna, gonna refer to my notes here. So I wanted to start with the question about how we can kind of locate Virgil's practice within a larger trajectory of black creatives that are working with the kind of cultural memory, the material of cultural memory, and material culture. If we can just kind of, I'm asking you all to kind of locate Virgil within that trajectory and that history.
Salamishah, you go first. Professor Tillet.
Okay. Well, it's on. Okay. Well, thank you for choosing this image, and honored to be here. Well, I guess I was thinking one of the words that was missing from at least some of the panels earlier was this idea of the African diaspora, and so the ways in which I think showing us this image as an African diasporic object, right? And then the way in which Virgil transports that or transfers that into, the plastic-covered couch is something that's, it encourages or discourages children to enter the living room, and then to transform that into something that is both high fashion and streetwear is pretty amazing, because it's changing something that's supposed to be a mark of inhibition to something that's everyday. And I think that tension you see in his work. But also I was thinking of this big question of, now I'll come back to this in other clips that I want to show, but the way in which he's uncategorizable, both to me is both part of like a child of Ghanaian immigrants and also a Midwesterner. So if I think if Virgil weren't black, we would think about the multitudes as being his inheritance. But because he's black, there are ways in which the limits are put on his aesthetic as he's pushing against them. And so I want to bring in this notion of someone who, as a child of an immigrant, you're both inheriting multiple traditions, you're crossing boundaries and borders, and as a child who's growing up in the Midwest, in Chicago in particular, you're just having this expansive identity. And so I think that's all of what's at play in his work. But because he's a black person, a black citizen, people kept on wanting to limit him. And so that tension also is there. So I want to locate him in the diaspora and the Midwest, but also what it means to be a black person who's forced to be put into positions that goes against their genius.
I think there's also something to trying to find these images or these materials that somehow feel universal within a black diaspora, like how that image of the couch could read to many people of many different types of African diasporic experience, and also something that's continual through the way that black people deal with these materials is a sort of like addition, like putting the plastic onto the couch, and also the way that, like for me as a kid, that made it something so like unappealing, but also like so familiar. Like it makes me think of like my grandmother's house or something. Yeah. So I think there's something to that. I think also to your earlier question about like what it means to add this black onto like black cultural memory or something like that, I was just thinking of the use of the quotations, which I don't know if it came up in any of the earlier talks, but that's like peak Virgil Abloh, and like the quotations is something that sort of like adds this speculation or puts into question like what is this thing that we've sort of like consider to be the thing, and making that sort of like the norm also. But I wanted to say something about the notion of like black annotation, and I sort of came to that term through Christina Sharp's writing, but the notion of black annotation and also black redaction as a sort of like continual thing that black people do to try and like take the thing and turn it into something of their own, which is very much what Virgil was doing.
To kind of riff off this idea, you bringing up Christina Sharp, and thinking about her work, I think a lot about this kind of emotional register that isn't really allowed in kind of academic discourse, and thinking about the emotional register of the plastic on the couch and a lot of Virgil's work, in the sense that there's a smell, there's a kind of feeling, there's a texture to that image that I think he's invoking through his designs. And so I think about the Air Jordan, this particular Air Jordan, and Virgil's relationship to Chicago and the history of Jordan, and also this kind of emotional connection to the shoe, and that the white isn't quite a white; it's a little yellowed. There's this connection to a past and to having a specific emotional moment with an object. Any responses to that?
Well, I guess with sneakers, I just think of this sort of like aspirational quality, or like how, I mean, again, on this conversation of like ready-mades, how that sort of as a symbol enters into the black community as something that's like ubiquitous and also in some cases out of place. Like it's a super expensive part of your outfit when the rest of your outfit like is not expensive. And so, I don't know, there's something about that kind of came to my mind when you said that.
Right. I also just wanted to get your thoughts on thinking about sneakers in particular and Nike in particular as a kind of item of material culture, specifically black material culture. How is Virgil kind of manipulating or working with that kind of existing relationship that the culture has to Nikes and to shoes?
It's interesting. We've been talking about this so much lately because we've been working on stuff related to his footwear design practice, but it's so powerful, and this relates to stuff that you guys have said, how V would take objects that are both like mundane and iconic, how much he revered certain like vernacular histories, right? He believed that the things that we as Black people think are dope are actually the dopest, no matter what rubric you're thinking about, no matter which medium, no matter which canon, which community. And then also, one thing we talk about a lot, especially in terms of his relationship to certain brands he worked with, like a Nike or a Louis Vuitton, is it really feels like he was the first designer at these places to interpret their histories and then circle those back into the designs of future iterations of the footwear. And so every single shoe he made at Nike, maybe not every single one, but especially a lot of the Jordan ones, he would close read archival versions of the shoe and then bring in those details, whether they were formal or whether they were just culturally resonant, into his own designs in order to cite, their histories. And a lot of times the histories he would cite in the shoe wouldn't just be like the moves that the designer at Nike made, but little pieces of it that were resonant for Black people in Baltimore, Black people in Chicago, or whatever. And so when I look at that, that's what I see, and it's one of my favorite parts of his practice, I think.
I love that idea for sort of like taking this process of like building a history or an archive and referencing it back to them, because it's something theoretically they should be doing, but then it's like no one would necessarily care about that history of sneakers if it weren't for Black people like praising them in that way. But something else I was also thinking about, because one of the topics we were talking about before this is sort of like people that are in the same vein as Virgil, and I struggle to think of someone because he's so interdisciplinary, but one of the people I did think of was like David Hammonds, who does this sort of migration between high and low and sort of pushing things together and making sort of like satirical, critiques of things. And specifically as it relates to like basketball, I think of this work that he created called Higher Goals, where it was like this basketball hoop that was built out of telephone poles, and it was like so tall, like there's no way you could reach it, but that sort of representing this aspirational relationship that people have to basketball as like a career. And so I also think of that when I think of like the sneaker.
It's just not related to the sneaker, but last year this time actually, I was writing an article for Harper's Bazaar. There's a Basquiat exhibit that's in New York, the first one curated by his sisters. And so it's a really deeply personal exhibit, and it's designed by Sir David Adige. And so I'm in this Basquiat world and trying to think about who are his successors. And so it's really, you can think of painters, but that didn't really quite fit. And it was Virgil and pre this moment of Kanye West. These were the inheritors of his legacy, because I was trying to think of an artist who was actively melding the high and low, who was actively invested in a particular commercial enterprise, but also pulling from the street, right? So these are, and I think this is a new way of thinking about both Basquiat and also Virgil's legacy, and the way in which I think when Virgil is, part of the difficulty I think for critics, particularly fashion critics, art critics, film critics, is that because he's so many disciplines at once, one doesn't have the grammar or the vocabulary to fully appreciate his aesthetic. And so, and part of that's because one's not really trained in African American studies or Afro-diasporic studies. And so artists who are in those disciplines are listening to music, are reading the writers, are looking at the performers. I mean, it's a multidisciplinary existence as artists. And so I think for me, I was like, well, what's the relationship between someone like a Basquiat who's thinking about sports and thinking about music and thinking about text and thinking about graffiti and thinking about the body and the black male body in these particular ways. And so I just want to add a kind of prehistory that I haven't written about it this way, but I think it's important to have that as part of our conversation as well. So.
Yeah, no, I really love that. Basquiat definitely, as a predecessor, I think because I feel like he also thought of himself as a ready-made and has certainly become one. Like, I feel like Basquiat definitely had this desire to be like so famous, which happened and continues to happen. And so the way that, you know, his art now becomes things people can wear, et cetera. And I'm sure he was painting on clothes at the time as well. And I think also the way he was not just a painter, like he was also an icon, he was a model, he was, I don't know, a lot of different things. He played music as well. And so that just sort of like energy to create and also like, I don't know, be a productive force, I very much see in Basquiat too.
So this conversation about Basquiat just kind of reminds me of kind of quote from Arthur Jaffa that's essentially about how black people are born conceptual artists. I think there's a degree to which hybridity and kind of multifacetedness is a survival mechanism and a tool. And I was just hoping that you all could speak to that hybridity kind of as a form that Virgil's working within. We're talking about the high and low, we're talking about the universal, but also the specific. But yeah, wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, another person to quote is like Fred Moten and his notion of like black people as inherently the avant-garde because one has to create themselves as a new people and constantly create oneself as a new people. And so I was thinking about that as, you know, part of this conversation as well. Like, what does it mean to always be ahead of one's time? And obviously this relates to lots of artists, Basquiat included, but also with Virgil's work. And I think it's an interesting thing because, you know, his work was appreciated in his time, but also the way in which I think the ongoing importance of his vision and the way that we will eventually catch up with it is also there. So to think of him as an avant-garde artist who defies discipline was part of the challenge, I think. And again, I came to him late, so I don't know him as intimately as most of the panelists. He's someone I knew in the pandemic and through Zoom and WhatsApp, so I didn't meet him in that way, but I interviewed him for pieces of the New York Times around racial justice and fashion. And as everyone has said, he's deeply generous and profoundly brilliant. But I do think that there are artists that I'm attracted to as a critic, and we had this shared connection for Nina Simone, that there are these figures who just, I mean, Shannon, you could probably talk about this really well, but that what does it mean, or Chloe as well, like, what does it mean to be both at the apex of a particular discipline, right, with Nike and Louis Vuitton, but then also still be misread? And I think that tension is quite clear in the reception, but also something that he was actively defying, and also through mentorship and hyper-productivity showing us a new way. And so I think he's just, as someone who reads people's work, who gets obsessed with work and tries to figure out how to situate them in histories and traditions, I just find that to be both admirable, but also like we're still catching up with him. And also he was so hyper-productive that it's going to take us a long time to figure out really where he was going. And so it requires all of these types of people to give us insights into parts of his aesthetic.
Yeah, I want to return to that idea of Moten and the avant-garde and Jaffa and the being like hardened into a diamond, I think he described it. But I was thinking of this aspect of ready-made and thinking like as a survival strategy, it's kind of like not just ready-made, but your own creations then becoming ready-mades as something to build on. It's like you have nothing, you make something, now I have something, and I'm gonna use that to make more things, and I'm sort of creating my own vocabulary. And also like when I think about that hyper-productivity, it's also like that's so much something that, you know, historically that act of like being exploited is so familiar. So it's like, how do you like appropriate the process of being able to define your own agency and how you want to put your energy out into the world? And I feel like he does that by saying, like, I'm going to do everything I want to do in my way as often as possible. And so even though it's hyper productive, it also feels like very like optimistic and like generative.
Yeah.
You all both kind of refer to this kind of like grammar or a kind of like poetics that's present in Virgil's work. Obviously language and words and iconography in that way that's like legible in that sense is super important. So yeah, I kind of wanted to think with you all about the importance of setting up that kind of grammar, that visual poetics, and how Virgil kind of executed that through his work.
You might know best.
So I think American in your practice, you talk about a kind of visual poetics and that being a part of conceptual art. The idea of kind of putting together maybe opposing images or images that are in tension. Salamishah, you talked about a kind of new grammar and kind of locating, thinking about the kind of material culture and histories that are inherited, from a kind of diasporic discourse, from a Black American discourse. So I'm just thinking about how those ideas kind of function in Virgil's work.
I'm answering super directly, but it made me think about Virgil's practice as an art director. And I don't think I really even knew what an art director was before I met V or spoke with them, right? It's like, what is an art director? Like putting vibes together. I'm failing at actually describing it because it's actually one of the most like difficult things to be good at and requires so many skills. It requires this really like associative brain, a visual acuity, a visual sensitivity, and like a deep curiosity across any number of disciplines or cultural domains to actually be really good at it. And he's arguably the best art director ever, I really think. And it's interesting as like a methodology, because I think a conversation like this, which is like slightly more on the academic side, you wouldn't think to turn to art direction as one of the sources of that poetics, but I feel like it really was, because it's like that sort of low practice of like, it's considered low insofar as it's like, people in commercial spaces know what art direction is, but I think art direction is not something that academics think about, or art historians think about, or architects think about. But the actual practice of bringing together like a disparate web of inspirations and visual references to make projects out of them, I think the source of a lot of the really poetic convergences you'd see in Virgil's work that you wouldn't see in anybody else's work. Because he was so curious and because he was so good at it. And then another thing I think about is, people have talked a lot today about V being multidisciplinary. And I think I find it hard sometimes to think about it in a historical way. I think about it more in like a personal way. Like, I think that he was an outsider in every space he was in, and was really cognizant about like defying that, like the determination to really master architecture, the determination to master DJing, to master fashion design, but not lose his sort of outsider perspective. I feel like that was always really key. And again, I think that was also a source of the poetics, that like, even as he climbed to the top of any profession, he never got rid of the outsiderness of his perspective. And it's like, it's worth noting that like, he was just honored by the CFDA with a Lifetime Achievement Award. He never won a CFDA award in his life. Like, that's crazy. The best, most impactful fashion designer of his generation, right? Never won one of those awards. And again, that attests to kind of some of the stuff that we're talking about.
But I think, like, when I was in grad school, we had to come up with this, you had to come up with like your own literary theory. And, we're reading like Plato, and it was like 1 week of like feminist theory and deconstruction, and lots of weeks of lots of and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna come up with a theory of sampling. That's my literary theory. And I thought it was interesting listening to the DJ conversation or the music panel earlier, because I think, and I want to think about this again, the way in which there's a there's a misreading and then there's also a deep appreciation. And this idea, like you just talked about, pulling from different traditions, like, but if you grow up with hip hop, you're not actually thinking of pulling from different traditions. You're just thinking everything is possible, and it doesn't compromise like who you are or your ability to create art. It's like everything's in the realm of possibility to create something new. So go back to the avant-garde. And so I think it's so fascinating, like looking at his work, like and thinking about why he was not appreciated by formal institutions or formal disciplines, even at the same time he again had succeeded and surpassed any other black person in particular realm. So there's that contradiction. But I think this idea of like discipline or certain formal traditions, and if you grow up as a black person in the diaspora and a child of hip hop, like you don't really, there are no walls. Like everything is possible and everything is yours to use, and it doesn't compromise your blackness and it doesn't compromise your ability to create good art. And so I think this is why critics didn't really understand, and also gatekeepers didn't really want to appreciate the aesthetic, because like if you're a good fashion designer, you're supposed to do certain things certain way. If you're a good architect, right, there's a certain way you're supposed to do things. But if you're someone who grew up thinking that anything's possible, then you're going to defy those traditions. At the same time, you're going to inherit them and say, this is a new way of doing it. So I think this is the legacy that I think we're going to have to contend with, because I think someone who's defying traditions and yet suddenly being celebrated by the very institutions, and this is why the Basquiat example I think is really useful, because in Basquiat's lifetime, no major museum would purchase his work. So no museum has its own private collections. And so his family has to license out. That's why we see him everywhere, because it's the only way everyday people can see a Basquiat piece is like on a sneaker or on a plate, because the museums missed the boat and only appreciated him belatedly. And so, anyway, throwing that out there.
That's really interesting. But I wanted to say like about what you were saying about growing up with hip hop and feeling everything's possible. It's not only that, but feeling like these fields as they've been conveyed to you are not yours. Yeah. So you don't have the same like I want to say respect for them, like the
allegiance.
Yeah, and there's so much about them that's constructed by this notion of like provenance or like a certain way of doing things that I think Diasporic was pointing to earlier with like the archive, that you need to do it in a certain way. And I think where I feel similar to Virgil is like not coming from like the art world, you don't have that same, feel that you need to like respect what the boundaries of that are. And so I feel even now, as I am getting more understanding of this sort of like academic side of it, I also don't feel that there needs to be an allegiance to that. You can sort of blend the high and low, and you can sort of like convey things in a way that communicates on so many different levels.
So in talking about kind of hip hop and high and low, we have the Pray for Paris, West Side Gun album cover, which is kind of sampling a Caravaggio David and Goliath painting with a small photo of West Side Gun and kind of in the medallion there. This is an image that Virgil created for the album cover. And so I kind of wanted to think about sampling as a kind of aesthetic and as a essential aesthetic of Black material culture in relationship to the canon. And I think we're kind of getting at this and what you all are saying before is just how do we as Black people sort of relate to the canon? How did Virgil relate to the canon? And his idea of like the Black canon. I think we kind of started to touch on this in previous conversations, but kind of wanted to get your responses to Virgil's responses to the canon.
Well, can we move on to another? What else? Okay. Oh, okay. Let's go. Can you go to the film? Keep on going. Okay. The next one. Okay. So, I mean, I think what I find interesting, so I think you sent me this film and I like fell in love with it. I was like, and it was also weird because like I didn't know how to write about it because I'm not a fashion writer, even though I dabble in only occasionally. And I was like, oh, this is like a true, beautiful. Is there more? Is there anything else? Okay, like so for me, this is like an example of pulling on, like there's the black canon, the Afro-diasporic canon. There's so many like fashion canons he's pulling on here, and so I think. Yeah, exactly. And then if you listen to it, like Saul Williams and Mos Def, and then there's a part where Saul Williams actually, for about 3 minutes, just lays out a canon. Like he just lists a whole bunch of people that constitute, and it's very diverse, but it's mostly black, right? And so I think that's kind of how I think of Virgil's relationship to the canon, that it's really diverse, but it's mostly black. And so these are the things in which he's kind of indexing, playing on, and actually trying to do with these major corporations is that, and by the time he's coming up, blackness is the center. Even if we're denying it or putting it to the side or not giving everyone their proper pay, blackness at this point is the center of American culture. So I think that the question of the canon is like one that was big in the 90s and like, who's in the canon, who's not in the canon. And it continues to, I think, be big in certain worlds. But if we're really honest, it's black people are fully at the center of the American canon in terms of art, or at least cultural production, even if they're still being denied access, payment, and visibility. So there's that tension. And I think, like this film, I think it's just such a beautiful, and I think, what do you do with a designer who makes films as part of their fashion, who makes beautiful films as part of their fashion shows in order to speak to multiple audiences at once? Like, what do you do with that person? And I think there's just a lot of missed opportunities and a lot of need to kind of go back and look at his work in new ways. So I don't know if I really answered your question about the canon. I actually don't like canon questions. I find canons boring. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, can you go back to the Caravaggio?
Yeah, you can answer that.
Well, because I was thinking of sampling from this sort of like, I guess, hip hop perspective where there's a certain amount of like, you can recognize the parts that are coming together, which I think is like representative of a certain moment of mixing and sampling that came out of like the DJ's mixing and everything. But I feel like that also sort of like laid the foundation for what you see with like meme culture. I hope this isn't too much of a stretch, but where like the referent is no longer like recognizable or relevant even. And so I feel like in some way that was like laying a foundation for that. And in that, I don't know if a notion of a canon like even is in question or is like important, because the canon becomes about how this thing can be resampled and recycled by so many people in so many different ways.
Right, and when I think about sampling, I think about the kind of educational aspect of sampling. So this notion that you're kind of pulling from something that, I don't know, maybe you have access to and you got your fingers dirty and you found a record that you like that no one knows about. And there's a kind of educational aspect to the person who's listening to that in a contemporary moment and saying, oh, I wonder what this track is in the background. I like this song, sounds good. What is this track in the background? So I kind of wanted us to think about Virgil as an educator in that way, in working with the material of the archive, of LV's archive, of Nike's archive, and really digging deep and kind of educating a public.
Talk about all the time, right? We've been talking about this week. Been sharing the codes, leaving breadcrumbs, feeling like he was always talking to a younger version of himself to show him the tools, the cheat codes, all the things that he picked up along the way that were so hard to learn because of all the barriers to entry for someone like him. How so much of his practice was about showing all the sources and all the resources that were the foundation of his work, such that generations after him wouldn't have to struggle as much to become who they wanted to become. And I think as everyone's referenced today, it was just this deeply generous spirit that motivated, I think, a lot of the work that I think is beyond inspiring.
I really like the phrase of breadcrumbs because it does feel like it's like even if you only heard Virgil speak for like 10 seconds, like you learned something. Like there's so much of this distilling of like these really like complex lessons, as you said, he learned over so much time. And I feel like in every moment there was this like pushing out or offering of something. And so I feel like in that sense, it's educational at all times. Even like the written use of language on the products, like telling you what it is, feels like educational in some way. Like it's trying to tell you something at all moments.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes critics who would write about his work didn't understand. People would comment on how he'd create something and there'd be 1,000 ideas in it, and they'd be like, "Why are there 1,000? There could just be 5." But there's 1,000 because it's like he's so excited to share with everyone all of the 1,000 things that inspired that particular thing. And I think thinking about B as an educator is a really cool framework.
Yeah. So Salamishah, you asked to include this image of Shikari and which is a still from the Sub 11 Seconds film, which is executive produced by Virgil in collaboration with Baffic and Architecture Films. So I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on this and how you thought it was relevant to this Black material culture conversation.
I thought the conversation earlier about the architecture panel was interesting because this idea of him making real buildings and kind of where his aesthetic was going. And for me, I was also just fascinated by the filmmaker and where his aesthetic was going. As someone who clearly was interested in continuing to kind of, like as I said before, make films. And I don't know if we're all obsessed with making films, as if every artist, writers, poets, architects, if we all want to make films, if that's where we all want to end up. But I find that fascinating. But also with this, I thought, well, two things. One, I had the honor of doing the conversation at the Brooklyn Museum with moderating with Baffic and Jim Joe. And so just this idea to return to this notion of collaboration and mentorship, which was deeply part of their exchange and the ways in which we've seen here today. And also just this idea of the ways in which I don't think, and if you go forward with Lauryn Hill, the way in which Black women were part of his aesthetic, his practice, to think of Lauryn Hill, he talks about her as a muse for the spring, summer 2020 show, and we can see that in Shanghai. And so I just wanted to think of, and a lot of my work as a critic is thinking about Black women as artists, as inspirations, as forgotten in the American lexicon. And so I also wanted to center these kind of two projects in which we see him both engaging, but also thinking about them in cinematic ways. And if you haven't seen the Lauryn Hill, it's like, as someone who's doing this project on Nina Simone and really came to Nina Simone through Lauryn Hill, this is like one of the most amazing Lauryn Hill things that exist. It's contemporary Lauryn Hill. It's a concert that she's doing. And I hadn't, I know a lot of Lauryn Hill stuff. And when I discovered this, I just was amazed because it's during the pandemic, but it's a brilliant Lauryn Hill concert. And again, I think it speaks to Virgil's ability to both cross, sound, sight, fashion, and to bring them all together in these really beautiful ways. And so I just think, and then to add this to the fashion show, this is like the music, the score to the fashion show itself. So I just think, I wanted to bring this up because I don't know if anyone's thinking about the cinematic Virgil Abloh. I write about film a lot, and I write about Black women a lot, and so I wanted to add these two figures to the conversation.
This Lauryn Hill performance, I feel like it's slept on. I feel like maybe it's because it was the pandemic, but how watershed it was for Virgil to bring Lauryn forward. I think it was one of her first public performances in a long time that was recorded. Super beautiful. You can find it on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
You can find it on YouTube? Is it on YouTube?
Yeah, it's on
I think
YouTube.
so.
Yeah.
And also just, film. I think film was something Virgil was increasingly interested in, partly inspired by some of the film work at LV that began during the pandemic, as just a mode of storytelling with so many possibilities. I don't want to say beyond fashion, but that could include fashion, but also transcend fashion. Fashion shows as a specific mode of presentation. And so I love this piece. I, of course, love the short film about Sha'Carri. Film is a way to kind of storytell about a lot of the research threads or a lot of the obsessions in his work through use of sonics, through use of visuals, through use of narrative tropes, sort of multidisciplinary at its root, but also like committing to film as like a specific practice.
Yeah, I think he references that in the Harvard GSD lecture we watched earlier, where it's like, you know, you don't have to create a mood board. There's so much that can be kind of told in the moving image. And I think, yeah, the Lauryn Hill film and Sub 11 Seconds just so perfectly kind of encapsulates that.
I want to say there's also something to this celebration of these particular figures. Like, I don't know what the process was for deciding to work with him, but I think of Lauryn Hill as someone that had a really hard time in the industry and in how people perceive her, and to overcome that has been very challenging. So I feel like in some way it's also a celebration of her, and then thinking of Sha'Carri and what she went through when she was, you know, ready to run. I'm just wondering if there's also this aspect of like celebrating these women.
So I think kind of as actually we should talk about this. American, you included this image. Yeah, can you kind of speak to why you thought it was relevant to this conversation?
Yeah, I chose this image because well, this aspect of manifestation, of seeing yourself in spaces that you weren't meant to occupy. And in this case, you know, he's literally describing dreaming about inhabiting a job. And that was something I very much resonated with, and just thinking about what it means to have this practice of manifesting. And I'm currently doing a research project about Octavia Butler, and she was very much also into this practice of manifesting and literally writing down what the reality she wanted to see was, and then doing it. And so I feel like there's also an aspect of that runs through the diaspora too, and so that's why this image felt like super important.
Oh, thank you for including it. And I kind of just wanted to close out in a kind of personal, reflective note. You know, I think all three of you all are kind of stewards of Black cultural memory and material culture. So I just kind of wanted to you know, get your kind of final statements on Virgil's impact on your work and kind of dealing with these kind of subjects.
Well, practically speaking, I would just say it was nice to have someone at 5 a.m. who was up. Maybe he was in Paris and I was in New Jersey, but just a fellow workaholic is always nice to have in the mix. But I also think this idea of just being able to pull on anything and also still be, to live with being misread. Like, you know, in terms of having a practice myself, I'm always someone who's seen as like, you know, a writer, an activist, an administrator. It's like you're living in all of these worlds at once, and sometimes people don't know how to. I mean, again, I did get a big award recently, so you're appreciated, but then you're also seen as someone who maybe should commit to one thing. And so I think I both drawn to appreciate and felt comforted by someone who could exist in multiple planes, in multiple worlds, and then you realize like they're the center. And I think that despite, you know, and I think Virgil, with at least in the fashion world and from conversations we had, obviously was like put off by the ways in which he was still being typecast. But I think as an artist, he understood that fundamentally didn't matter, even as he's being rejecting the typecasting. And so I think that helps someone like me kind of be free to kind of do the practice that I want to be, to continue to do. So I think a model of freedom. And I think we heard that quote earlier about how he envisioned freedom for himself.
Yeah, I feel that too. I think I'm constantly continuing to learn from Virgil, and I think it goes back to this notion of education. Like, there's just so many ways to learn from how he was working and how he built community, and how he respected those around him and inspired them. And even like seeing all these panels today, I feel like I was re-energized to like how I can think about my practice working in this way that's more generous, more productive. And so I don't know, I'm just inspired all over again.
I'll just close with saying, V's one of my favorite artists ever, and I feel lucky to have had some proximity to that, and I feel that it's very important for people, for all of the people who admired him. I hope and appreciate everyone who's willing to sort of document how important he was, and to continue to think about his work, to continue to bring forward all of his lessons. He thought about history so much in his practice, and so for me personally, it's really important that V takes his rightful place in the future archive of cultural history. And so think something like today, as small as it is, feels like a really important, little chapter in what I hope is like a long, long practice that we all kind of collaborate on to remember him. Thanks,
Thank you all.
everybody.